I think we can all remember our first horror movie experience. I believe mine was The Shining, and I somehow watched it when I was 8, and it kind of ruined me for the next year or so. But that's little things that I'm probably never going to get back, you know. I'm never going to be that scared. As scared as I was watching that, The Ring, The Sixth Sense. It's just never going to happen again. I think people walk into horror movies with way too high of expectations when they should be looking for specific things, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. And as someone who's a real big fan of horror, I feel like the genre gets disrespected several times whenever there's a lot of really cool gems out there that a lot of people never get to see. This is mainly because those cool gems that people don't get to see won't be released by big companies because they're kind of weird, they're kind of graphic, they're bloody, and they're just kind of a turnoff to the mainstream audience, which I think is a big problem with today's horror movies. But let's get into it now. This statistic kind of tells you everything you need to know about the audiences watching these horror movies. I'm going to go over a few of the best horror movies of the last year or so. The Babadook has got a 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but an audience score of 75%. When you look at recent movie It Follows, has a 95% rating, and only 66% of the audience liked it. You look at a more, not mainstream horror movie, more artsy horror movie called Starry Eyes, which I thought was amazing. Got a 76% rating, and only 60% of the audience liked it. And finally we go to Oculus, which was probably the biggest movie out of all of these. So it really had a chance to make a dent in the horror scene. Got a 73% rating, and only 52% liked it. Why is it that a great deal of the audience watching these movies don't think much about these movies? You know, what do they expect out of horror? And I think that a lot of people just want to be scared, and they want to accept these other great things about horror movies that really make horror movies stand out. I accepted a long time ago that a movie just is not going to scare me. That doesn't mean that the movie can't give me thrills or give me chills. You know, movies can be really fun cinematic experience. Just if you're not expecting to have your pants scared off and not be able to sleep that night. That's probably not going to happen because, you know, we're basically grown-ups. Unless you're a kid watching a horror movie for the first time, you've got to accept these things about horror movies that really make them stand out and make them shine and make them modern-day masterpieces, basically. I remember in 2009 watching Drag Me to Hell with my friend, and we were the only 2 people in the theater. And I remember the movie sort of scaring me and me thinking that it was kind of silly and funny and ultimately really thrilling and an amazing cinematic experience. But yeah, almost everybody that I talked to hated it, and 61% of the people on Rotten Tomatoes liked it, after it got a 92% fresh score. It ultimately comes down to that I think that the mainstream audience don't understand these tones in horror movies. If you take yourself too serious, the movie's just going to be ridiculously silly without trying to be. So that means that you got to add this humor to it, and whenever people's like, well, that movie was more funny than scary. Yeah, that's the point, I think. One of the best horror movies of the past 10 years, The Cabin in the Woods, isn't scary at all. But you still have to call it a horror movie because there's so much horror influence in it. Even though it's really funny and really fresh and original and has a lot of twists, it's still ultimately a great horror flick. Every once in a while, a good traditional horror flick like The Conjuring will come along, and most people will agree on it that it is legitimately scary and fresh and pretty cool. But is that any better than Slither, which got really good reviews but got panned by the audience? I don't think it is. Slither is a great horror flick. It's funny, it's disgusting, and it's entirely original. Another thing with modern day horror movies is jump scares. While a lot of people complain about jump scares, I think that the majority of the people really want to see jump scares because they think that that's what's scary about the movies, having them jump out of their seat and having their heart race. And believe me, horror movies can make your heart race without having jump scares. I just watched It Follows, and the sound, the editing, the visuals, and the music is where the horror lies in that movie. It's not an entirely scary movie, but if you look at the way that the movie was done, it can be completely horrifying. These are things that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to when they're watching these horror movies. The art and the craft that goes into making these horror movies. And in a world where remakes and reboots and all these other things are huge, you know, you gotta think outside the box to make a truly original horror flick, which means tinkering with the sound, the visuals, the camera work. These are things that really make horror movies stand out now, I think. And there's been so many ghost haunted house films, demon possession films over the past 5 or 6 years, where only like half of them have been decent and the other half have just been garbage. But you look at a movie like Jeepers Creepers that came out in the early 2000s, which kind of got mixed and panned reviews by critics. I think if that movie came out now, it would get amazing reviews, because it would be original, and at that time, I don't think it was what critics were looking for or audiences. But I think it's kind of a fun, campy horror movie that would get praised nowadays, I think. It ultimately just comes down to the fact that horror movies have changed so drastically over the years. And you look at The Shining, and that's just slow burn the whole movie, but it's the visuals and the sound that Stanley Kubrick created that makes that movie completely haunting and horrifying. But now I think we're getting in a new spell of horror movies that are entirely fresh and original, and nobody really even cares about it, except for just a small majority of the people, and I think it's a huge problem. And I know people are scared by different things, but I just think people need to open up their head and their mind and accept these weird horror movies like Starry Eyes, and I'd even say It Follows is kind of weird, but they won't accept it. You know, they don't want to think outside the box. They want more of the same because that's what they feel comfortable with. That's what they grew up with these movies. That's what scared them when they were younger. So they won't accept these newer kind of art house films that just make them feel odd and a little bit disturbed. And they just don't want to accept it, I don't think. I remember going to watch The Last Exorcism in 2010 in a packed theater, and everybody booing when the movie was over. I mean, booing, really? I think with the exception of the ending, the movie is really creepy and original and way better than I thought it was going to be. I think it's almost a perfect movie until the last 5 minutes, which is indeed awful, but it doesn't warrant an overall boo from the audience and explicits towards the screen. I mean, come on, audience. It just comes down to the fact that people expect too much from horror movies. They expect to basically die during the horror movie and not accept the movies for what they were. I think that's what I'm trying to come across. And it's what I've been trying to say for a long time. I just think people need to open up their eyes and open up their mind and accept these horror movies instead of just trying to be completely scared. Because, you know, come on people, we're adults now. Movies aren't going to scare us the way they did when we were 10. Let me know some horror movies that you feel got a bad rap from your friends or just people in general, because I think there's a lot of really, really cool things happening in the horror universe out there that a lot of people just don't get, or they just completely dog because it's different. Thanks for watching.